Before Mars even becomes the subject, there is something you have already done, and you probably did it almost automatically. You searched for your zodiac sign. You looked at the title, moved quickly through the opening, and searched the names that might tell you whether this message belongs to you. Somewhere inside that quick search was a quieter question. Am I one of the people this is really about? So let us answer that question before anything else. Yes, Cancer, Capricorn, Aries, and Libra are the 4 signs standing closest to what unfolds today. But no, this is not an exclusive circle where 4 people are allowed inside and everyone else has to remain outside the door. Today, Tuesday, Mars leaves fast-moving and mentally restless. Gemini, and enters Cancer, the sign connected with family, memory, emotional attachment, and the people we protect without always explaining why. When something returns home, the entire house notices. The sound of the door opening belongs to everyone inside, not merely to the people sitting nearest the entrance. That is why the more important question is not whether your sign appears in a particular list. The deeper question is, what comes home with Mars, and what will that arrival ask you to defend? This matters because Mars entering Cancer is not a transit that divides humanity into people who are affected and people who are untouched. It changes the emotional temperature through which action itself is experienced. From today onward, your motivation, your anger, your protective instincts, your determination, and even the way you pursue what you want begin moving through a much more emotional layer. Every sign has something vulnerable somewhere in its life. Every person has something they keep close because losing it would hurt more than they admit. That is why the atmosphere may already feel unusually sensitive. There is a reason the ground feels exposed before Mars even crosses the threshold. Today, Mercury forms a square to Chiron. Words can therefore land with a force that seems disproportionate to the subject itself, because an ordinary comment can touch an old nerve that existed long before the conversation began. At the same time, Venus is moving toward a deep trine with Pluto, while also stretching toward a hazy opposition with Neptune. Attraction becomes stronger. Personal values become more refined, and uncertainty can surround the difference between what you genuinely desire and what you only imagine you desire. Nothing about this emotional landscape is neutral. Mars is also completing its final movement through Gemini, forming a trine to the North Node and pulling you toward something that appears consequential even if you still cannot give it a clear name. That pull is the hinge. Today, it becomes the crossing. The direction of your energy begins turning away from endless arguments, choices, information, and mental calculations, and toward attachment, loyalty, belonging, and memory. If you've been paying attention to the sky this week, you may already recognize the feeling of standing on ground that keeps shifting beneath you. The last quarter moon in Taurus a few days ago helped separate what still deserved your energy from what had become too heavy to justify the space it occupied. Chiron became retrograde, reopening a healing thread you may have believed was already finished. Now, Mars changes the temperature of motivation itself. This is not random movement, it is a turning point. So instead of asking whether you're included, imagine something more revealing. Imagine that a door opens, and someone walks through carrying everything you have been trying not to feel. What would you protect first? What would you instinctively move toward? What would make your body react before your mind had time to explain the reaction? That is the territory Mars enters in Cancer. It is like a soldier returning from a battle that was fought almost entirely through words. He has spent his time in Gemini navigating arguments, information, choices, conversations, and mental speed. Now he arrives at a home filled with memories and delicate emotional belongings, still carrying the reflexes of conflict. The lesson is not that the warrior has become powerless. The lesson is that the environment now requires a different definition of strength. In this house, constant presence can protect more effectively than force. The warrior has come home from the war of words, and just before Mars crosses the threshold, it completes its trine to the North Node from the final degrees of Gemini. Think of that as the last message sent from the front line, the final communication from a chapter dominated by debate, mental overload, quick reactions, and the strategic use of language. Mars in Gemini has been concerned with speed, alternatives, mental flexibility, and knowing which word to deploy at the right moment. That chapter closes on Tuesday. What begins afterward operates according to a completely different emotional logic. Cancer is cardinal water. It initiates, but it initiates through feeling. Traditional astrology describes Cancer as the fall of Mars, but that statement is often misunderstood. It does not mean Mars suddenly becomes incapable of acting. It means Mars can no longer depend only on direct force and straightforward confrontation. Desire becomes connected to relationship, will becomes protective, action can become indirect while remaining powerful. The warrior is not weaker. The terrain has changed. Now picture the sky at the exact moment of the crossing. When Mars enters Cancer today, the Moon is still in Cancer. For a brief period, Mars and the Moon occupy the same space. Then the Moon moves into Leo. By the end of Tuesday, the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, and Jupiter are all in Leo, while Mars stands alone at 0 degrees Cancer. The contrast is striking. 4 planets are gathered beneath the bright visibility of Leo, while Mars stands quietly at the doorway of a darker private room, deciding what deserves protection and what deserves action. This creates a tension between what is deeply personal and what is publicly visible. Leo wants expression, recognition, creativity, and the freedom to be seen. Cancer wants emotional safety, belonging, understanding, and a place where the heart does not have to perform. During the 6.5 weeks ahead, you may find yourself acting from an intensely private emotional truth, while circumstances around you seem to demand confidence, visibility, or performance. The skill is not choosing between the private self and the visible self. The skill is allowing what is emotionally true to nourish what you show the world without sacrificing either side during the translation. And Mars does not arrive into silence. Later on Tuesday, Mercury opposes Pluto and forms a trine to Neptune. The mind becomes capable of digging beneath appearances, questioning motives, confessing what has been hidden, imagining possibilities, or receiving an intuition so vivid that dismissing it becomes difficult. Venus forms a trine to Uranus, creating an atmosphere in which a relationship or personal value system may suddenly need more space, greater honesty, or an opening you did not realize was available. The warrior enters a house that is already carrying electricity. This is why the most useful question during this transit is not whether you are too emotional. It is not whether you are overreacting. It is not even why everything suddenly feels personal. The question that actually reveals what Mars in Cancer is trying to teach you is this: what is this feeling trying to protect? Anger under this transit may contain something much softer underneath it. The sharp reaction that appears when someone minimizes your effort may be protecting a need for recognition that you never learned to ask for directly. The pressure you feel when plans change without your involvement may be guarding a need for safety that was violated long before this particular moment. The cold withdrawal that happens when someone gets too close may be protecting grief that has never found the right language. Mars pursues, cuts through obstacles, and defends. Cancer bonds, shelters, and remembers. When they occupy the same sign, the warrior and the protector become one figure, and your task becomes learning which one is actually holding the reins in each moment. Protection born from love is completely different from reactivity born from an old wound that has learned to disguise itself as love. Think about the cancer shell. It is not a prison. It is a boundary that can move with you. You carry it into the world. You can close it when the environment is genuinely unsafe, and you can open it when the environment becomes trustworthy enough for your real voice to emerge. The shell itself is not the problem. The danger comes when you forget that you have one, when you forget how to open it, or when you keep it sealed for so long that the people outside eventually stop knocking. And this is where something unexpected may begin surfacing during the 6.5 weeks ahead. Inherited anger. Families often carry invisible rules about who is permitted to express anger, who is responsible for maintaining peace, who must take care of everyone else, and whose needs are allowed to be spoken only after everyone else has been satisfied. Mars in Cancer can bring those rules into consciousness, not through an abstract lesson about family history, but through a real conflict happening in real time with real people. You may suddenly recognize that the intensity of a present reaction is connected to an older emotional pattern. You may notice that what appears to be a disagreement is actually touching a question of belonging, loyalty, safety, or the right to have needs of your own. The awakening comes when you stop judging the feeling simply because it is strong and begin listening closely enough to understand what the feeling is guarding. That is where this transition becomes more than a change of signs. It becomes a moment when action begins asking for emotional honesty. And as Mars takes its first steps into Cancer, that question becomes impossible to ignore. Because the next part of this journey begins with what happens when the old rules of protection are finally brought into the light. The deepest lesson of this transit is not about blame, and it is not about deciding which family pattern was right or wrong. It is about recognizing what you inherited, deciding what deserves to continue through you, and having the courage to become the place where an old pattern finally stops. Mars in Cancer carries a fierce kind of loyalty, and that loyalty can become one of its greatest strengths. You may have spent much of your life being braver on behalf of other people than you ever allowed yourself to be on your own behalf. You may be the person who acts immediately when someone you love is in trouble, the person who appears at the hospital, the person who protects another person's dignity before ever asking whether your own dignity needs protection too. You may know exactly how to defend someone else and still hesitate when the person who needs defending is you. During this transit, that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The developmental task is to turn some of that courage inward. Protect yourself with the same seriousness you would bring to protecting someone you love. That is where the real transformation begins, and it brings us back to the 4 signs standing closest to this Mars transit. Cancer, Capricorn, Aries, and Libra deserve special attention, because if your sun or ascendant falls in one of these signs, the entrance of Mars into Cancer activates the cardinal cross in your chart through conjunction, opposition, or square. You are likely to experience this movement earlier and more directly than many others, not because everyone else is excluded, but because your chart places you closer to the doorway as it opens. If Cancer is your sun or ascendant, Mars enters your first house, the area associated with the body, identity, action, and personal direction. This makes the transit intensely personal. Your desire becomes more visible, your impatience becomes harder to disguise. Your courage, competitiveness, anger, and instinct to act all become things you must handle directly. For the next 6.5 weeks, you cannot simply hand these parts of yourself to someone else and hope they manage them for you. The lesson is not brute force. The lesson is clear assertion. Say no before you disappear into taking care of everybody else. Ask for what you need directly instead of silently testing whether another person will prove their loyalty. Move when movement is necessary, before frustration becomes so frozen inside you that you no longer know what you are actually angry about. Your opening comes almost immediately. The day after Mars enters Cancer, on Wednesday, Mars forms the sextile to Chiron. This creates a useful opportunity for practical courage and manageable repair. It does not require a dramatic declaration or some enormous emotional performance. It can be one honest action that begins changing a pattern. Pay attention to the days that follow, however, because the later quincunx to Pluto and square to Neptune will test whether the method you are using actually matches the reason you are acting. Your guiding principle should be clarity. Keep later decisions transparent and reversible whenever possible. Do not create permanent consequences from temporary emotional intensity. If you are a Capricorn sun or ascendant, Mars stands across the zodiac from you in your 7th house. This is the territory of partners, clients, competitors, contracts, and the open mirror created through relationship with another person. Other people may become the clearest reflection of what you have been carrying underneath the surface. A partner may need protection. A client may push against a boundary. A competitor may reveal something about what you genuinely want. None of this automatically means separation or conflict must end a relationship. It means the relationship itself can no longer remain emotionally impersonal. The work is to protect the relationship from the problem instead of turning the other person into the problem. Put agreements into writing. Define the actual conflict before deciding how to respond to it. If you notice yourself moving toward a cold withdrawal, do not dismiss that reaction. The withdrawal itself may be revealing something important. There may be a vulnerable place inside you, asking to be acknowledged, while rigidity and emotional armor appear because vulnerability feels too expensive. The instinct to shut down can feel like strength when you're exhausted. But under Mars in Cancer, the more courageous move may be to identify what the withdrawal is protecting before allowing it to become a permanent wall. Aries has a particularly personal relationship with this transit because Mars is your ruling planet, and it is changing signs directly in front of your experience. The entire tone of your momentum can shift. Cancer occupies your 4th house, the territory of home, roots, parents, family systems, private foundations, and the emotional ground beneath your public life. Your attention can turn toward your home, your family structure, your living environment, and the deeper question of where you actually belong when nobody is watching. Your specific warning is important. Neptune is in Aries, and Mars forms a square to Neptune approximately 1 week after entering Cancer. That square can make the boundary between a genuine threat and a projected fear much harder to recognize. It can become difficult to distinguish between fighting for something meaningful and fighting simply because remaining still feels unbearable. Do not bring a public conflict into your home merely because home feels like the safest place to release it. Make the foundation functional first. Take care of practical needs before resentment begins writing the script for you. When the private base is unstable, even a small outside pressure can feel enormous. When the foundation is cared for, you have somewhere steady from which to respond. Libra, Mars enters your 10th house, the area connected with career, reputation, authority, responsibility, and your public role. The sign-based square brings pressure to the old tension between maintaining peace and protecting something deeply personal. Venus, your ruling planet, is currently in Libra and moves through a trine to Pluto, an opposition to Neptune, and a trine to Uranus around the entrance. Relationships, values, image, freedom, and professional decisions therefore intersect at the same time. Your medicine is advocacy without appeasement. Charm can be useful, but charm should never require surrender. If you say yes simply to preserve harmony and then explode a week later, the explosion will cost more than the honest no would have cost in the first place. Speak for your team. Renegotiate a role that has quietly consumed more of your private life than you intended to give. Set a boundary with a client or authority figure before resentment draws the boundary for you, because resentment rarely chooses the place where a healthy boundary actually belongs. Now stay with me, because the 4 signs named most often in a transit like this are not the entire story. Being closest to Mars does not mean being the only person who hears the door open. There are other placements that can catch the first wave, even though a simple list usually leaves them out, because 4 signs are easier to explain than the full complexity of a birth chart. If you have Taurus placements in the early degrees, whether that means your sun, ascendant, or a natal planet is located in the early degrees, You can be directly touched by the Mars-Chiron sextile. On Wednesday, Chiron is positioned in early Taurus, and Mars reaches toward it from 0 degrees Cancer. This creates an opening that is practical and specific, something connected with the body. Confidence, stability, money, or self-worth may receive a doorway toward an action that can actually be managed. This is not a miraculous solution. It is one usable step. That distinction matters because healing often becomes more real when you stop demanding that everything change at once. One honest action can create movement where years of emotional pressure created paralysis. If you have Aquarius placements in the early degrees, you can be touched by the Mars-Pluto quincunx later in the week. Pluto is positioned in early Aquarius, and when Mars forms this awkward angle of adjustment, the central question becomes power. More specifically, the issue concerns the relationship between your personal authority, the transformation you are building, and the workload you carry every day. A responsibility that was originally meant to serve you may have gradually become the thing controlling you. You may suddenly realize that the schedule, role, obligation, or structure you created for a purpose has quietly become the structure dictating who you are allowed to be. That realization matters because Mars in Cancer can make the cost of carrying too much emotionally visible. Now let us be honest about the limitation of any zodiac list. Your natal degree, your house placements, and the rest of your birth chart determine the actual intensity of a transit far more precisely than a simple ranking based only on your sun sign. Cancer, Capricorn, Aries, and Libra are the clearest group in this situation, but they are not an exhaustive list. If something in this message activates something inside you, take that seriously. Use what helps. Trust what becomes clear. If nothing in you responds, you do not have to force meaning onto it. Let it pass. The house is always larger than the title that attempts to map it. And this brings us to the part that can become uncomfortable. Protection can quietly turn into control. Everything we have discussed so far can sound warm, compassionate, and deeply human. But even warmth can become a hiding place when it is used to avoid confronting what is actually happening. The 4 signs most likely to feel this transit early can also be among those most capable of turning protection into a weapon. The rest of the zodiac is not immune either. So before you become comfortable simply knowing where you sit at the table, you need to understand what happens when the soldier never puts down the shield. Later in the week, Mars forms a quincunx to Pluto. When direct confrontation feels too exposing, power can move underground. The signs of this are subtle at first. Silence can become a method of punishment instead of a pause for processing. Help can be offered while invisible conditions remain attached. Loyalty can be tested through questions that appear innocent, but are designed to measure whether someone will choose you. Decisions can be made for everyone because you believe you are protecting everyone, even though nobody else was given the opportunity to consent. Caring for other people can slowly become a cage built by the protector, locked by the protector, and eventually forgotten as a cage. This is one of the most important shadows of Mars in Cancer. The desire to protect can become so convincing that control begins wearing the clothing of love. Then, approximately 1 week later, Mars forms a square to Neptune, and the motives themselves can become harder to read. Anger may transform into avoidance. Momentum may dissolve into restless confusion. A fantasy about saving someone can replace a clearly defined objective. You may find yourself fighting for something that you cannot clearly explain when someone asks you what the fight is actually about. You only know that it feels urgent. You know that it feels personal. You know that it feels as though it should not require an explanation. But something that cannot be named clearly cannot be targeted clearly. That is why the mental atmosphere surrounding the entrance matters so much. Mercury opposes Pluto and forms a trine to Neptune right around the entrance, which means the potential trap is already present at the threshold. An emotionally vivid story can feel impossible to separate from a verified fact. Suspicion can begin speaking in the language of intuition. A sensation of certainty can become so strong inside the body that it feels undeniable, as real as a heartbeat. But emotional certainty is still not the same thing as evidence. Check before accusing. Check before resigning. Check before purchasing something, making a promise, or burning a bridge that you may need later. The distinction is not complicated, although applying it requires discipline. Protection is proportionate, direct, and aimed at creating genuine safety. Reactivity assumes danger before checking the facts. It punishes the person who happened to touch the wound. It treats emotional intensity as if intensity itself were permission to escalate. Your feeling can be completely valid, while the action you take because of that feeling can still be wrong for the situation. That space between a valid feeling and a proportionate response is where much of the real work of these 6.5 weeks will happen. So let us move into the most practical part of this entire passage. The bravest useful action is often not the loudest one. It is usually the smallest specific action you can take before confusion arrives. The cleanest opening of the week comes the day after Mars enters Cancer. On Wednesday, August 12th, Mars forms a sextile to Chiron. A new moon gathers in Leo. Mercury forms a sextile to Uranus. That combination deserves your attention because it brings together a practical opening for repair, a fresh emotional beginning, and the possibility of an unexpected insight or conversation on the same day. This is not accidental weather in the symbolic language of the transit, it is an opening. But remember what a sextile actually requires. A sextile opens a door. It does not carry you through it. Mars sextile Chiron means that an opportunity to address something tender is available, but you still have to participate. Healing does not automatically descend from the sky. Instead, this is a period when a courageous and manageable action may encounter less resistance than it normally would. Repair what is genuinely repairable. Try a different response inside a conversation that normally follows the same exhausting pattern. Begin an experiment instead of demanding a revolution. Allow the new moon to be understood correctly as well. It follows the entrance. It does not cause the entrance. These are separate layers of the same week, and together they create a useful sequence. Tuesday changes the private motivation, and Wednesday gives that inner shift an opportunity to become a visible intention. Let your movement outward come from an authentic internal need instead of becoming another performance of transformation. That is the assignment. Before you protect anyone else, before you withdraw from anyone else, there is one thing to do first. Before you make a decision that reorganizes another person's life alongside your own, say one genuine protective sentence out loud. Do not keep rehearsing it silently inside your head. Say it aloud. It can be as simple as saying that you need reassurance. It can be telling someone that you are angry about one specific thing. It can be saying that you need time before you can answer. It can be explaining that you can help with one part, but not another. One honest sentence can accomplish more than a week of internal circling because it gives the feeling a name and gives Mars something concrete to act upon. Instead of guarding a secret, Mars can begin acting on a truth. The other person is also given something real to respond to, rather than being handed a silence they are forced to interpret. And people almost always interpret unexplained silence differently than we intend. This small act can cost almost nothing compared with the emotional price of allowing an unnamed need to remain buried until resentment takes control of the story. If you need a physical channel while the words are still forming, this transit can work through the body and the home as well. Cook something connected to memory. Secure something in the house that has become loose or neglected. Have the honest conversation at the kitchen table that you have rehearsed everywhere except the kitchen table. Move your body before anger decides how your body is going to move for you. Feel the emotion completely, then give it a precise direction. Mars remains in Cancer for approximately 6.5 weeks. This is not a weekend event that disappears before you have time to understand it. It is long enough to teach you something real. It is long enough to expose a pattern you once believed was permanent. It is also long enough for you to discover which forms of protection genuinely serve you and which ones only serve fear. The instruction is simple, even when carrying it out is not. Feel it fully. Do not numb it. Do not minimize it. Do not pretend that an emotion is irrational simply because it arrived without asking permission. Name it accurately. Do not name the story you built around the emotion. Do not immediately name a villain. Name the actual need underneath the armor. Then act proportionately. Protect what is genuinely vulnerable without turning vulnerability itself into a weapon that keeps everyone at a distance. Let your home become a foundation for action instead of a bunker against reality. Let loyalty remain a choice you make consciously rather than a debt someone collects without your awareness. And eventually, let the soldier place the shield against the wall. The shield may have protected you once. It may have been necessary at another time. But it does not need to remain in your hands at every table, in every relationship, and in every conversation. You do not have to abandon protection. You have to become more precise about what actually needs protecting. What this house asks from you is not greater force. It asks for the quiet courage to remain present, to feel what is happening, to name what is true, and then to choose your action instead of allowing an old wound to choose it for you. Watch Wednesday closely. Mars sextile Chiron, beside the new moon in Leo, creates a small but real opportunity to repair something you have only been carrying, and to allow a private form of courage to enter visible life. Notice what rises to the surface. Sit with it before moving on it. Trust the impulse that feels specific rather than the one that feels dramatic. If you began this message wondering whether you belonged inside the circle or outside it, remember what this entire transit has been showing you. You were never standing outside the house. You were already inside it. The question is, what you choose to protect during these 6.5 weeks. Let that question stay with you as Mars settles into Cancer, because the answer will not necessarily arrive as a dramatic revelation. It may appear as one boundary, one conversation, one honest sentence, one repaired corner of your home, one moment when you choose not to repeat an inherited reaction. And that is how a pattern changes. Not always through a battle, but through the quiet decision that the next generation of your life does not have to inherit the same wound in the same form. As this transit unfolds, remain attentive to what feels protective and what feels controlling. Remain attentive to what your anger is guarding. Remain attentive to whether your actions create genuine safety or merely temporary relief. And when the next wave of emotion arrives, do not rush to prove that you are right. First ask what needs protection, what is actually true, and what response will still make sense once the intensity has passed. That is the difference between carrying the shield and knowing when to put it down. That is also where the deeper promise of Mars in Cancer begins to reveal itself.